One of the biggest things that we're trying to do here locally is drive the adoption of new varieties, and one of the big things that industry is always asking for is more information on them before they're adopted. What we've done in this demonstration is we've taken 5 tested, long-term adopted varieties. We've taken 5 relatively new releases, and then we've also looked at 5 promising clones that are coming through the program, just to try and see if there's any linkages there, and essentially if the root growth characteristics of a well-known variety align with a fairly new variety, and then also those root growth characteristics align in a newer kind of promising clone, well then hopefully what we've learnt about that variety over the years can give us a starting point for when we adopt that new variety.
Hello and welcome to Cane Matters. I'm Sonia Campbell, and today we're coming to you from Mackay, where I'm joined by SRA's District Manager for Central, Dylan Wedel. Welcome, Dylan.
Thanks, Sonia. It's good to be here.
When it comes to growing sugarcane, we often talk a lot about what's visible above the ground, but today we're digging beneath the surface and examining parts of the underground architecture of cane, more specifically comparing the root systems of different varieties and what this could mean for crop management. Dylan, can you tell us more about your root system demonstrations here and how they came about?
Yeah, so I guess over the last couple of years, one of the priorities that's been raised in the Central District when we do our district productivity plan reviews each year is the functions of the root systems on the different varieties. There's a lot of interest in what's happening below the ground. There's been some previous work that SRA has invested in, but there continues to be an interest here in the local region. So it's something that we've been discussing internally, looking at different ways that we could approach it, and finally there's been a way that's popped up that we've explored a little bit further.
The interest that's been shown here in learning more about this aspect of different varieties isn't surprising, given root systems are almost the black box of a plant. I'm sure this interest wouldn't be just confined to this region.
No, I think it's something that would be experienced across all growing regions. The growers that normally raise these kind of questions are the ones that are probably looking a little bit closer at their farming system and how different varieties are performing in the same kind of circumstance. So rather than just, branding a variety with a particular trait, they want to try and understand what it is that's, causing that variety to grow that way, or particularly around harvestability or returnability, those kind of growing kind of parameters, trying to explain what's happening with those different varieties. And the root system, it's providing food and nutrition for the plant, but what it's also doing is keeping the plant standing upright. So something that we've noticed, particularly in the Mackay region or the Central region over the last couple of years, is we've seen some bumper crops. We've seen some Goldilocks conditions where we've grown some great crops of cane. At the same time, we've had the perfect storm for really high population pressure within cane grubs. So what we've seen is we've grown big crops that tend to want to lay down and be a bit lazy. Equally, while the grubs are there, they're pruning roots and making some different varieties fall out of the ground. So I guess, that's what's probably prompted some of these questions around the root systems, is the big crops and the grub pressure that we've seen recently. But, there's so much that we know about what's happening above the ground, but what's happening below the ground is a bit of a question mark.
Can you tell me more about the demonstrations and the concept behind them?
What we've tried to do is take a process for being able to assess root systems. It was a process that Dr. George Pipperitis, who's our local breeder, first saw on a conference a year or two ago, and straight away sent me some pictures and spoke to the presenter afterwards to get some more details and said, hey, look, Dylan, we've probably found something we can start looking at, which is pretty cool. So over the last 6 months, we got ourselves the gear and put together this bit of a proof of concept demonstration of being able to look at what different root systems are happening with different varieties. So the main process that we've followed is a process of being able to assign a root growth angle index to a variety. So what we do is you plant a one-eye set of a particular variety in a mesh cup, and what we do is we count the number of roots that are growing at a few different angle fractions below horizontal. So generally the the higher the root growth angle index, the more it suggests that those roots are heading straight down. The lower ones are probably suggesting more horizontal type root development. So it's just a proof of concept type thing to be able to see if there was a bit of a trend and difference, and it's whether it's something that could be explored further locally or pursued larger in a research project.
Okay, so you've placed one-eye sets into mesh cylinders, as you've explained, which are placed into pots here at the station where you can observe the root growth over time. It's in a very controlled environment. Are you confident that you are seeing results that would be similar to patterns experienced in the field in a commercial environment?
Yeah, so I think when you say controlled environment, I think we thought we were in a controlled environment, but what we've experienced, this is why it's a demonstration of this concept, is that maybe our irrigation wasn't as well controlled as what we'd hoped. What we actually saw throughout the trial was a fair bit of variability in the root growth parameters in different pots, purely based on the pot's proximities to the sprinkler outlets. So I think that's all part of this research kind of activity where you learn the strengths and weaknesses of a process in your systems, and it's definitely something we'd look into further in trying to improve the irrigation system. But I think, the end goal that I'd like to see us get to is actually planting these mesh pots out in a farm and in soil that a grower's using and under their irrigation and management practices, just to see how it grows in that circumstance, because you could probably assume that it's going to be a little bit different to how that variety grows in potting mix on a pot on a bench. So yeah, that would be the next step, to try and see if it's actually got a practical alignment out in the field.
Now, you're still progressing with your demonstrations, and for clarity, we are recording this today on November 18, 2025. You're presenting your observational data to invited growers and other industry stakeholders at 3 events this week at Proserpine, Mackay and Plain Creek. As well as sharing your data, you're also seeking industry input into this work. What are you hoping to gain from these sessions this week?
I think it's really just about trying to get some industry buy-in and trying to be able to provide timely feedback to industry that, hey, look, what you've been asking for over the last couple of years hasn't fallen on deaf ears, and we're responding. I would have loved to have gone out to industry as soon as George first told me about this process of assessing root systems, but that was probably a little bit too early, and I certainly don't want to wait until there's a final report published about a trial before we actually go to them and speak to them. So yeah, I think it's important, and one of the big things that we were trying to get through grower engagement through these events is actually a little bit of feedback around the in-field growing characteristics of these different varieties, and over the space of 3 days with 3 events, we're going to end up seeing 50 plus growers across the Central District in different areas. If we can pool all of their different observations together, maybe we can start seeing a few trends in how we can explain characteristics out in the field and link that back to the root systems. It's interesting when you show some of these graphs to the growers, they'll look at it and say, yep, I can agree with that. I can see why that is. I've always got dramas with harvestability, or the harvester likes to pluck those stools out of the ground, or we always need to make sure that we haven't got the base cutters too deep when we're harvesting that variety, or that when I plant that variety deep, it stands up well, but when I plant it shallow, it doesn't. I think it's trying to draw upon those industry observations to try and help build a bit of a bigger picture.
What's the end goal? What are you hoping to achieve out of these demonstrations?
Look, I think, it's probably a 2-part kind of approach. Like, ideally, we'd like to try and gather enough information to be able to, prove the concept so that someone can pursue a little bit further in-depth research in this field. Alternatively, we might find a few little pearls of wisdom that we can use here locally. So, one of the biggest things that we're trying to do here locally is drive the adoption of new varieties, and one of the big things that industry is always asking for is more information on them before they're adopted. So, what we've done in this demonstration is we've taken 5 tested, long-term adopted varieties. We've taken 5 relatively new releases, and then we've also looked at 5 promising clones that are coming through the program, just to try and see if there's any linkages there, and essentially if the root growth characteristics of a well-known variety align with a fairly new variety, and then also those root growth characteristics align in a newer kind of promising clone, well then hopefully what we've learnt about that variety variety over the years can give us a starting point for when we adopt that new variety. So if we know that that variety has proven itself through the breeding program in terms of productivity results, well, it's about how we're going to best grow that variety once it's released. And if we know that it's got a similar looking root system to one of these varieties that we've had before that potentially didn't really like to be planted shallow or was susceptible to harvest damage if the base cutters are a little bit too deep in the dirt, well then we can try and provide growers with a bit of a starting point. You know, we're not trying to say that wholly and solely we know what's happening, but it just kind of, there's a few holes have lined up in the cheese, and well, this must be a pretty good starting point.
And handy information, obviously, to bring back to our breeding program leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the questions that come up in Mackay on Monday was, where do you see this fitting in the breeding program, or is the breeding program interested in it? You know, the idea come from our local breeder. During the event, we had 2 of our local breeding team in the room, you know, participating. So, yeah, there's definitely interest in this space. Definitely not making any commitments to it being integrated into the breeding program. You know, we haven't proven anything. We're just trying to see if it's something that we can use in terms of a grower relation kind of output at the end around variety adoption.
How long are you hoping to keep these demonstrations going for?
Yeah, so I guess we've had to pull up for this year now. All of our plant source materials all been harvested. This is the last demo run that we can run for this year. But next year we'll definitely regroup and have a look at a potential different set of varieties, and then also start looking at that in-field type arrangement of planting as well. So yeah, there's been really good feedback from the growers that have been participating in the events, and yeah, I've got a lot of keep up the good work type remarks. So there's definitely interest there and still buy-in, so it's definitely worthwhile pursuing a little bit further.
One thing I neglected to mention is that a large portion of this work has been carried out by District Delivery Officer Hayley Keats. For anyone who would like more information about the demonstrations, you can contact Dylan or Hayley at SRA's Mackay station, or log on to our website sugarresearch.com.au and search for our news section. Well, thank you, Dylan, for joining me again today and giving a great insight into your demonstration work.
No worries, thank you.
And a big thank you to our listeners for again tuning in to another episode of Cane Matters.